Behind the multi-million-dollar empire of the Rolling Stones lies one of the most disturbing controversies ever associated with the band. At 47, bassist Bill Wyman entered a relationship with Mandy Smith, who was 13 at the time. From the beginning, the issue was never just the age gap itself, but the larger question of how fame, wealth, and influence appeared to shape the way the public processed what was happening. Years later, their lavish wedding on her 18th birthday became, for many critics, the moment that helped recast a deeply troubling story as something far more socially acceptable. The environment where this dynamic began is crucial. The year was 1984. The setting was the BPI Awards in London, a crowded, noisy elite gathering of the British music industry. The room was packed with executives, musicians, journalists, and photographers. Alcohol flowed freely. Egos collided. It was a space designed for adults operating by adult rules. Mandy Smith was brought into this environment by her older sister. A 13-year-old was dropped into the middle of a high-stakes industry party. Wyman spotted her. He navigated through the crowd. He initiated contact. He did not speak to her as someone her age. He spoke to her as an equal. This marked the beginning of a highly controversial dynamic between them. He bypassed the natural awkwardness of her age by elevating her status. He made her feel sophisticated. He made her feel seen by a man whom the rest of the world worshipped. For a teenager from a modest background, the sudden, undivided attention of a famous millionaire was intoxicating. It bypassed her critical thinking. It scrambled her internal radar. At 13, Mandy Smith could not reasonably be expected to understand the full implications of the attention she was receiving from a world-famous adult musician. What may have felt to her like admiration and glamour has since been viewed by many critics through a far darker lens, one shaped by age, vulnerability, and power. That imbalance sits at the center of the controversy. A teenager of that age did not have the experience, authority, or emotional footing of an adult woman, and that is precisely why so many later observers argued that the relationship could never be understood as an equal one. From there, the conditions surrounding the relationship became increasingly troubling. Mandy Smith was drawn into a world defined by adult power, celebrity access, and relentless public attention. The role of her family, the response of the press, and the larger force of the Rolling Stones' fame all became part of the same storm. At the center of it stood Bill Wyman, protected not by secrecy, but by a cultural environment in which stardom seemed to soften scrutiny. From that point on, the relationship continued to develop in ways that would later draw widespread criticism. Over time, her lifestyle changed dramatically as she was introduced to environments far beyond what would be typical for someone her age. The meeting at the BPI Awards was only the beginning. What followed was the gradual construction of an entirely different reality around Mandy Smith, one that pulled her away from the ordinary world of school, teenage friendships, and age-appropriate boundaries, and placed her inside the orbit of a famous adult rock star. That shift did not happen by accident. Over time, her image, routine, and public presence were shaped in ways that helped her appear older and more at ease in adult settings than she really was. Critics later argued that this transformation became central to how the relationship was sustained in plain sight. Her transformation was not merely fashionable, it was tactical. Wyman funded excursions to exclusive London boutiques, systematically replacing the flat shoes and simple dresses of a schoolgirl with the sophisticated uniform of a seasoned woman. Heavy cosmetics were applied not to enhance her features, but to bury the soft, unformed roundness of her early youth. This was not a makeover. It was a carefully constructed optical illusion. By artificially aging her public persona, they disarmed the bouncers, pacified the press, and successfully blurred a deeply uncomfortable reality that was unfolding in plain sight. That visual transformation mattered because public life often runs on appearances. In adult venues, in tabloid photographs, and in the broader celebrity world surrounding the Rolling Stones, image could shape perception faster than fact. The more mature she appeared, the easier it became for people around her to suspend the obvious question of age. That does not erase responsibility, but it helps explain why the relationship could continue so visibly without provoking the level of intervention many people would expect. In that sense, appearance became one of the most effective shields in the entire story. She was frequently seen accompanying him in adult-only venues across London. The emotional impact of that forced maturity has long been part of why the case remains so disturbing. Publicly, Mandy Smith was presented in a way that suggested adulthood, sophistication, and belonging in elite social spaces. In reality, she was still a young teenager, far removed from the stage of life those spaces were built for. That divide between image and reality sits at the heart of the controversy. Many later observers argued that it likely placed immense pressure on her because the role she was being asked to occupy was fundamentally out of step with her age. She was drawn into the subterranean world of the rock elite. These were not environments designed for young people. These were dark, deafeningly loud spaces fueled by adult substances, alcohol, and unchecked egos. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of stale liquor. Grown men and women engaged in erratic, destructive behavior. It was a volatile ecosystem where the normal rules of society were suspended. Wyman placed a 13-year-old directly into the center of this chaos. She sat on leather couches surrounded by people 3 times her age. She watched famous musicians consume various substances. She listened to conversations she lacked the vocabulary to understand. She witnessed the high-stakes dynamics of the entertainment industry operating at full capacity. She was a silent spectator in a theater of excess. She was being taken into late-night environments that were designed for adults, not for someone her age. Long hours, exclusive clubs, and the pressure to appear comfortable in those surroundings became part of the life she was expected to inhabit. That expectation alone is revealing. A 13-year-old should not have been required to blend into nightlife, celebrity circles, and adult routines as though nothing about it were unusual. The fact that she did so, publicly and repeatedly, is one of the clearest signs of how far the situation had drifted from anything resembling a normal adolescence. Placed in adult social settings, Mandy Smith was surrounded by conversations, expectations, and behavior far beyond what any ordinary 13-year-old could naturally belong to. That gap matters. It suggests a world in which her role was less about being herself and more about fitting into an image that others had already constructed around her. Later critics often describe this as one of the most disturbing aspects of the relationship. She was present everywhere, photographed everywhere, discussed everywhere, yet her own age and vulnerability seemed constantly pushed into the background. This environment acted as a toxic incubator. The situation raised concerns about the level of influence he may have had over her at such a young age. He was isolating her from any healthy, age-appropriate reference points. A normal teenager goes to school. She argues with her friends. She complains about homework. She experiences the gradual supervised transition from childhood to adulthood. Mandy Smith was denied this transition. She was forcefully evicted from her youth. Her social circle was entirely obliterated. She stopped seeing her peers. She could not relate to girls her own age anymore. What could she possibly discuss with a classmate? Her classmates were worried about math tests. She was worried about navigating the mood swings of a 47-year-old millionaire and avoiding the flashbulbs of the paparazzi. The gap between her reality and the reality of a normal teenager was unbridgeable. She was marooned on an island of wealth and influence, entirely cut off from the mainland of normal human development. The erasure of her early years was systematic and deliberate. Wyman replaced her school books with nightclub itineraries. He replaced her friends with music executives. He replaced her mother's guidance with his own absolute authority. He became the sole architect of her reality. She learned to view the world entirely through his lens. She learned that her value was not based on her intelligence, her character, or her potential. Her value was based strictly on her ability to look like a woman and remain silent while standing next to Bill Wyman. The strain of that lifestyle appears in later accounts to have been serious. A young teenager was being exposed to late nights, adult pressure, public attention, and an environment that offered little resemblance to a stable adolescence. Even without dramatizing it, the implications are difficult to ignore. Many observers have argued that such conditions were likely to carry both emotional and physical consequences over time, especially for someone so young and so dependent on the adults shaping her world. That is part of what makes the story troubling long after the headlines faded. Yet, she could not show it. The red lipstick had to remain perfect. The posture had to remain upright. The illusion had to be maintained at all costs. Wyman observed this physical and emotional strain. He did not stop. Critics have argued that the power imbalance in the relationship raised serious ethical concerns. Isolation, exhaustion, and constant image management only deepened the imbalance at the center of the relationship. The more her daily life revolved around adult expectations, the harder it became for anything about her situation to resemble the freedom, protection, or ordinary development associated with her age. Critics later argued that the styling, the schedule, and the social world around her all worked in the same direction. They kept her locked inside an adult narrative that did not match her age and left very little room for independence or resistance. Behind the adult image presented to the public, she was still a young teenager navigating a world completely invisible to a society blinded by flashbulbs. But a relationship this controversial could not continue on image alone. It also depended on the failure of the one force that should have protected Mandy Smith first: parental judgment. That is why the role of her mother became such a central and disturbing part of the story. For many critics, the question was never only what Bill Wyman did, but how the adults closest to Mandy Smith allowed the relationship to continue at all. The defeat of her mother's protective instincts was not a sudden collapse. It was a gradual, systemic erosion of boundaries, funded entirely by the boundless capital of the Rolling Stones. Patsy Smith did not live in a world of private jets and endless bank accounts. She inhabited a working-class reality. Her world was defined by mathematics, rent, groceries, the cost of electricity. The limitations of a modest income dictate every decision in a working-class household. It creates an underlying chronic hum of financial anxiety. It builds a psychological vulnerability. Bill Wyman leveraged his massive wealth directly against that working-class vulnerability. He did not approach Patsy Smith with a sinister proposition. He arrived bearing gifts. Wyman initiated a campaign of overwhelming luxury. He altered the geography of the Smith family's existence. He sent chauffeur-driven limousines to their street. A limousine in a working-class neighborhood is not just a car. It alters the status of the people who step inside it. The neighbors watch. The social hierarchy shifts. When the long black car idled outside her door, Patsy Smith made a choice. She stepped inside. She sank into the soft leather seats. She closed the heavy door, shutting out the noise of her ordinary life. The interior of the car smelled of expensive cologne and polished wood. It smelled like the end of financial worry. In that enclosed, climate-controlled space, the compass began to spin wildly off its axis. Wyman escalated the deployment of his wealth. He arranged holidays. He did not book cheap tourist packages. He flew the family first class to exotic, sun-drenched locations. He placed them in 5-star hotel suites. He paid for dinners at restaurants where the prices were not listed on the menu. He handed over a lifestyle that Patsy Smith could never have achieved through a lifetime of honest labor. A gift from a millionaire is rarely without expectation. It establishes an invisible debt and a clear authority. He becomes the benefactor. The power dynamic fundamentally shifts. Patsy Smith transitioned from the head of her household to a dependent of Bill Wyman. The relationship survived by hiding behind a collective delusion. Patsy Smith looked at the 47-year-old rock star sitting next to her 13-year-old daughter. She saw the age gap, the heavy makeup, and the adult clothing. Yet, instead of triggering immediate alarm, these obvious warning signs were rapidly repackaged into a narrative of glamour, access, and celebrity opportunity. That reframing is what makes the mother's role so deeply controversial in retrospect. The dynamic was not simply tolerated, it was actively justified, effectively softening and pushing aside the very concerns that should have demanded immediate protection. She convinced herself that Wyman was providing a launch pad for her daughter's future. She looked at the economic prospects of her neighborhood and compared them to the glittering world of the music industry. She told herself she was being a good mother. She told herself that denying this relationship would be denying her daughter a chance at greatness. She rationalized the arrangement as the necessary entry fee to the elite class. The delusion required constant maintenance. She had to ignore the physical evidence of her daughter's strain. When Mandy returned from late-night parties in London, pale beneath the cosmetics, her eyes vacant and exhausted, Patsy chose to see the glamour. She looked at the dark circles under her daughter's eyes and called it the price of fame. She saw her shrinking into an adult costume and called it sophistication. The failure was profound. It was not a brief lapse in judgment, but a sustained pattern of decisions that many later critics viewed as enabling rather than protective. Critics have since questioned the decisions made by those around her, particularly regarding how the relationship was allowed to continue. For any young person, the outside world can already feel unpredictable and unsafe. What makes a case like this especially disturbing is the sense that the place where protection should have begun instead became part of the problem. That collapse of parental protection is one reason the story continues to provoke such a strong reaction. Many later observers saw it not only as a scandal involving fame and age, but also as a devastating example of what happens when the adult most expected to safeguard a vulnerable person fails to do so. Mandy Smith was trapped in a psychological vice. The rock star applied pressure from the outside. The mother applied pressure from the inside. Mandy possessed no allies. She possessed no safe harbor. If a 13-year-old is uncomfortable with the advances of an older man, her first instinct is to run to her parents. Mandy could not run to her mother. Her mother was wearing a designer dress paid for by the benefactor. Her mother was drinking champagne purchased by the benefactor. Her mother was actively facilitating the arrangement. She internalized a heavy lesson. She learned that her physical and emotional boundaries were secondary. She learned that her discomfort was an acceptable price to pay for her family's happiness. She absorbed the heavy, crushing responsibility of maintaining her family's new socioeconomic status. If she rejected Bill Wyman, she would not just lose a famous companion, she would plunge her family back into their previous ordinary existence. The chauffeur-driven cars would disappear. The exotic holidays would stop. The neighbors would stop staring with envy. A 13-year-old was placed inside a situation where adult ambition, status, and dependency appeared to matter more than her well-being. That is why critics have so often returned to the role of the family around her. In their view, Mandy Smith was not protected from the pressures created by celebrity power. She was left to absorb them. She watched her mother transform. She saw the pride in her mother's eyes when the paparazzi flashed their cameras. She heard her mother bragging to friends about their association with the Rolling Stones. The mother became the most effective public relations agent the arrangement could ever have. She legitimized the dynamic. She provided the necessary social cover. When the press asked questions, the mother stood right there, smiling, validating the situation. The presence of the mother signaled to society that everything was acceptable. Her mother's public presence also appeared to lend the relationship a degree of legitimacy that many later critics found deeply troubling. The isolation of the individual was now complete. Isolation is not merely physical distance from other people. True isolation is the absence of anyone who perceives your reality. Mandy Smith was surrounded by people. She was surrounded by band members, music executives, journalists, and her own family. Yet she was completely alone. No one in that crowded, noisy, glamorous ecosystem recognized her as a vulnerable youth. They recognized her only as Bill Wyman's accessory. She learned to perform the role with chilling accuracy. She learned to suppress her fear. She learned to bury her confusion. She developed a profound disconnect between her internal emotional state and her external physical actions. She smiled when she was unsure. She nodded when she did not understand. She surrendered her autonomy because resistance was futile. Resistance would only anger the powerful man who controlled her schedule and disappoint the mother who controlled her home. The role of Mandy Smith's mother remains one of the darkest and most controversial elements of the story. More broadly, the case has often been cited as an example of how the entertainment world can blur moral boundaries when youth, celebrity, and money collide. Fame does not operate in a vacuum. It depends on adults, institutions, and narratives that decide what will be protected, excused, or ignored. In this case, critics have argued that the family's failure to draw a line became one of the factors that allowed the relationship to continue in plain sight. The historical record dispenses with the myth of the unaware parent. Patsy Smith possessed the same basic imperatives as any human being. She knew the age of her daughter. She knew the age of the bass player. She understood the societal rules. Critics later argued that the usual moral and protective boundaries appeared to bend under the pressure of wealth, status, and proximity to celebrity. In that reading, the relationship was not merely tolerated. It was allowed to continue through a series of choices that placed access and advantage above protection. The situation has often been cited as an example of how power dynamics can blur boundaries in the entertainment industry. The transaction was highly successful, the money flowed, the access was granted, the lifestyle was upgraded. The only casualty was the psychological architecture of a young person. This dynamic exposes the corrosive nature of extreme wealth. Bill Wyman's fortune did not just buy clothes and cars, it acted as an element that dissolved the moral fabric of an entire family. It demonstrated that highly questionable behavior is not solely the result of individual action. It is often the result of an environment where wealth grants total impunity. Wyman operated with the supreme confidence of a man who knows the influence of his status. The case has often been remembered as an example of how wealth and influence can distort adult judgment, weaken moral resistance, and leave the most vulnerable person in the situation with the least protection. She was left to navigate a deeply challenging reality. She was forced to participate in adult activities, attend adult parties, and engage in adult conversations while possessing the emotional maturity of a middle school student. She appeared present, but was emotionally disconnected from what was happening around her. She watched her image being paraded around. She watched her mother applaud the spectacle. She watched the world consume the images in the daily newspapers. Later accounts of the relationship have often emphasized how little control Mandy Smith appeared to have over the world forming around her. Decisions about her image, her public presence, and the direction of her life seemed increasingly shaped by adults with more power, more money, and more influence than she could possibly challenge. That loss of autonomy is one reason the story remains so unsettling. It suggests a young person being carried by forces she did not create and was not equipped to resist. As the relationship became more visible, it also became a public story shaped by forces much larger than the two people at its center. Family decisions, media attention, celebrity management, and the cultural power of the Rolling Stones all helped frame how it was seen. The controversy no longer existed only in private. It was unfolding in full view of the public, yet still seemed to move forward with remarkably little meaningful intervention. That combination of visibility and impunity remains one of the most troubling elements of the entire case. London is a city constructed upon centuries of law, It is the geographic center of the British legal system. It is the home of Scotland Yard. The legal age of consent in the United Kingdom is a rigid mathematical boundary written into the code. The statute exists for a singular purpose. It exists to protect the young from adult influence. Bill Wyman was 47. Mandy Smith was 13. The age difference placed the relationship in a deeply controversial and legally sensitive context. What made the controversy especially striking was how visible it appeared to be. This was not a private rumor hidden from public view. The relationship was photographed, discussed, and circulated through the press with a level of exposure that made the silence around it all the more difficult to understand. Images appeared in newspapers, in public spaces, and in the wider celebrity culture of the time. For many later observers, that visibility only deepened the question of why such an openly controversial relationship drew so little decisive intervention. Yet the authorities did not arrive at Bill Wyman's residence. Despite the public nature of the relationship, there was no major legal action taken at the time. A controversy of this scale does not unfold in isolation. It develops within a larger structure of money, influence, image management, and institutional silence. That is why the case is so often discussed not only in terms of Bill Wyman himself, but also in terms of the wider entertainment environment that seemed to absorb, soften, and normalize what many later critics viewed as deeply alarming. Bill Wyman possessed the ultimate defensive shield. He possessed the corporate machinery of the Rolling Stones. The Rolling Stones were not merely a rock band. They were a multinational corporation. They generated hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. Entire industries relied on their stadium tours, their record sales, their merchandise, and their cultural footprint. A severe intervention against the bass player would not just affect a man, it would disrupt a massive international supply chain. It would threaten the financial interests of record labels, promoters, shareholders, and managers. When Bill Wyman appeared in public with a 13-year-old, the executives in the high-rise boardrooms did not hold emergency meetings to discuss the welfare of a minor. They held meetings to discuss risk management. They discussed liability. They deployed crisis management teams. They deployed lawyers. They deployed public relations specialists. These individuals did not view Mandy Smith as a human concern. They viewed her as a public relations vulnerability. She was an issue that required immediate containment. The objective was to protect the asset. Bill Wyman was the asset. The legal team and the crisis executives understood the visual reality. They could not hide her. She was already in the public eye. The paparazzi had already captured the images. The strategy, therefore, shifted from concealment to rebranding. If a controversy cannot be hidden, it can still be reframed. That appears to be one of the most important dynamics in how this story was absorbed by the public. The public relations machine initiated a massive campaign of cognitive distortion. They dictated the terms of the conversation. They fed the British press a steady, highly curated diet of spin. They aggressively policed the vocabulary used to describe the relationship. Media coverage at the time often framed the relationship in softer, more ambiguous terms. They replaced the technical terminology with the vocabulary of celebrity gossip. They called it a controversial romance. They called it a taboo love affair. They framed Wyman not as an exploiter, but as a charming, aging rock star swept up in an unconventional relationship. They weaponized the cultural capital of the rock and roll lifestyle. The Rolling Stones built their empire on rebellion. They sold the image of danger and anti-establishment defiance. Critics later argued that the mythology of rock and roll rebellion helped blur the seriousness of the situation, encouraging parts of the public to see it less as an alarming age imbalance and more as another piece of celebrity excess. One of the most persistent criticisms of the case is that fame appeared to alter the terms of public reaction. Many later observers argued that an ordinary man in the same situation would likely have faced far harsher scrutiny and far less cultural indulgence. Whether stated openly or not, celebrity seemed to create a softer layer of interpretation around the relationship. That perception remains central to why the story is still remembered not just as a scandal, but as a case study in unequal accountability. The fame neutralized the outrage. The wealth purchased the benefit of the doubt. This strategy required the complicity of the British tabloid press. Fleet Street possessed the cameras. The journalists knew her exact age. They held the power to hold the situation accountable. Instead, much of the tabloid media treated the story as sensational celebrity material rather than sustained scrutiny of an alarming and controversial relationship. The editors calculated the economics of the situation. They realized that moral outrage did not generate as much revenue as scandal. Mandy Smith sold newspapers. Her presence on the front page guaranteed higher circulation numbers. The media conglomerates monetized her situation. Tabloid coverage repeatedly transformed the relationship into consumable celebrity spectacle, focusing on glamour, fashion, and public appearances while drawing attention away from the far more serious question of Mandy Smith's age. They wrote breathless, full-page columns analyzing her wardrobe. They detailed her lavish vacations. They speculated on her jewelry. They manufactured a fairy tale. They called her the luckiest teenager in the United Kingdom. They called her the envy of schoolgirls across the nation. In hindsight, many observers believe the tabloid press helped soften public understanding of what was happening. By wrapping the story in glamour, fascination, and celebrity language, coverage often made the relationship appear more like scandalous entertainment than a deeply troubling situation involving an underage person. That framing mattered. It influenced how the public saw the story, and it remains one of the clearest examples of how media tone can distort moral clarity. The cognitive dissonance created by this media narrative was absolute. Externally, the world was presented with the image of a glamorous, willing participant in a high society adventure. The public consumed the image of a girl who had everything. Internally, Mandy Smith was struggling. She was trapped in a psychological environment constructed by public relations executives. Her nervous system was constantly flooded with the adrenaline of surviving an adult environment she did not understand. She was attending late-night parties filled with adult stimulants, alcohol, and ruthless ambition. She was desperately trying to play the role assigned to her by a middle-aged man and enforced by an entire corporate structure. She could not speak her truth. The public relations machine managed her voice. If a journalist managed to secure an interview, the parameters were strictly controlled. She was handed scripts. She was coached on her answers. She learned to smile on command. She learned to deflect questions about her age. She became a vessel filled with the expectations of the men who controlled her narrative. If she complained, she would threaten the money. She would threaten the status of her mother. She stood in front of cameras as a teenager whose youth had been absorbed into a story shaped by fame, commerce, and public image rather than by protection. The adults in the room failed her entirely. It was a complete, systemic collapse of societal responsibility. It was not just the mother, it was not just the band, it was the entire ecosystem of the London elite. Nightclub owners allowed a 13-year-old to bypass their security cordons. They allowed her to occupy tables in venues where alcohol was served to adults. They looked at the famous bass player and they looked the other way. Waiters served meals at midnight, photographers, editors, and public figures all existed within the same cultural moment in which the relationship was highly visible. And that visibility has since led many people to ask why stronger intervention seemed so absent. The silence was striking, and for many later observers, it reflected a broader failure among powerful institutions and influential adults surrounding the story. It was a silent collective agreement that the rules did not apply to men who generated massive economic activity. Bill Wyman moved through London with the swagger of an untouchable figure. He operated with total impunity. The relationship unfolded in an environment where celebrity influence, profitable media attention, and weak adult resistance appeared to reduce the level of scrutiny it might otherwise have faced. The machine was running perfectly. The situation was obscured entirely by the blinding glare of fame. During this period, public attention continued while the situation remained largely unchanged. The team operated with a calendar and a calculator. They possessed a single, unwavering objective. As the years passed, the controversy remained inseparable from the fact that Mandy Smith had been underage when the relationship began, and that reality continued to shadow how the story was viewed. 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. The legal team counted the years. They counted the months. The strategy was a holding pattern. They had to maintain the illusion until the clock ran out. They fed the press the steady diet of glamour to distract from the mathematics. They pacified the mother with relentless luxury. They kept her isolated from her peers to prevent any sudden onset of independent thought. The pressure on her during these 5 years was incomprehensible. She lived in a state of suspended animation. She was a public secret. Everyone knew what was happening, yet it continued. She walked through crowded rooms, feeling completely unseen. What the case came to represent for many later critics was a profound failure of trust, accountability, and moral clarity in the face of fame and power. She absorbed the toxicity of the environment directly into her developing brain. The strain was compounded daily. It was a chronic, sustained campaign of psychological pressure. She was denied the fundamental right to grow up naturally. Wyman maintained his control through a combination of influence and indulgence. He provided the lifestyle, but he demanded adherence. He monitored her interactions. He monitored her public appearances. He ensured that the disguise never slipped. The heavy makeup remained in place. The adult clothing remained mandatory. The visual presentation had to be maintained until it was no longer necessary. To many later observers, the case exposed how wealth, fame, and public fascination can combine to weaken scrutiny and leave the most vulnerable person in the story with the least protection. The corporate machinery effectively deflected the system. The media turned a young person into a product. The society prioritized the entertainment provided by the rock star over the well-being of the youth. Behind the mythology of rock and roll rebellion lies a stark operational efficiency. The machinery of fame readily consumes vulnerability to sustain its own illusions. Bill Wyman did not face official inquiry. He faced the flashing bulbs of the paparazzi, and he smiled. He knew his wealth was a formidable fortress. He simply had to wait. He had to maintain the operation until the calendar triggered the final phase of the strategy. The liability had an expiration date. The date was her 18th birthday. The machine prepared for the transition. The crisis management team prepared to execute the final maneuver to permanently seal the case and grant the individual absolute immunity. June 5th, 1989 marked the turning point. Mandy Smith turned 18, and with that birthday, the public and legal framing of the relationship changed in a dramatic and undeniable way. The heavy threat that had hovered over Bill Wyman for half a decade vanished. The age difference did not change overnight, but the legal and public meaning attached to the relationship undeniably did once Mandy Smith was no longer underage. The holding pattern was over. The containment phase ended. The legalization phase began immediately. Many critics later argued that the marriage changed the way the story was publicly understood, helping recast years of controversy within the more socially acceptable frame of romance and commitment. The marriage, which took place when she turned 18, marked a turning point in how the relationship was publicly perceived. It was the ultimate insurance policy. A public, legally binding marriage would permanently sanitize the preceding 5 years. Society forgives a husband. The law respects the institution of marriage. A wedding ring would act as a shield against any retroactive investigations or lingering public outrage. The legal team knew that a lavish wedding would rewrite history. It would force the public to view the entire disturbing timeline through the lens of a legitimate, albeit unconventional, love story. The wedding was engineered to be a blinding spectacle. It was a tactical deployment of extreme wealth designed to overwhelm any remaining objections. The public relations machinery went into overdrive. They did not attempt to hide the ceremony. They weaponized it. They invited the press. They courted the paparazzi. They transformed a controversial timeline into the social event of the season. Mandy Smith was dressed in a spectacular designer gown. She was paraded in front of the flashing cameras. She walked down the aisle surrounded by the elite of the British music industry, politicians and socialites. The mother, Patsy Smith, sat in the front row, validating the transaction she had initiated 5 years earlier. The cameras captured the smiles, the extravagant floral arrangements, and the sheer overwhelming luxury of the event. The British public consumed the images. The operation worked flawlessly. The visual spectacle overpowered the dark mathematics of the relationship. The public saw a legendary musician settling down with a beautiful young woman. They saw the culmination of a highly publicized courtship. They did not see the 5 years of isolation. They did not see the lost youth. They did not see the overwhelmed teenager buried beneath the bridal makeup. They accepted the sanitized narrative. They applauded the union. The marriage certificate was signed. The ink dried. Bill Wyman secured his position. His fortune was protected. His reputation was cleansed. The utility of a shield ends the moment the battle is over. The day after the wedding, the dynamic fundamentally shifted. The thrill of the transgression was gone. After the marriage, reports suggest that the relationship quickly began to change. Mandy Smith was no longer a forbidden individual. She was an 18-year-old woman with legal rights. She was theoretically capable of developing an independent voice. She was capable of asserting boundaries. To a man who had spent 5 years meticulously shaping a silent, obedient accessory, a wife with a voice was a complication. The opulent mansion they shared quickly transformed into a silent, suffocating space. The elaborate dates stopped. The intense attention vanished. The extravagant gifts that had masked the fundamental emptiness of their connection were no longer necessary. The dynamic had shifted, the objective was secured, and the interest faded. Wyman retreated into his own world. He resumed his life. He left his new bride alone in massive empty rooms. Mandy Smith sat in the silence and confronted the terrifying reality of her existence. She had been trained for a specific narrow role. She had spent the critical formative years of her psychological development learning exclusively how to appease an aging rock star and survive the nocturnal environment of the music industry. She knew how to pose for paparazzi. She knew how to tolerate the presence of intoxicated executives. She did not know how to be a wife. She did not know how to be a normal 18-year-old. She possessed no formal education beyond the middle school level. She possessed no functional social skills outside the VIP rooms of London nightclubs. She had no friends her own age. She had no independent identity. Her entire psychological architecture had been constructed by the man who was now ignoring her. The marriage lasted 17 months. It was a brief postscript to a 5-year situation. The divorce was swift and clinical. Wyman executed the separation with the cold efficiency of a corporate restructuring. The legal team mobilized. They protected his assets. They ensured the financial settlement was heavily weighted in his favor. He discarded her. He moved on to his next endeavor. He returned to the stadium tours and the recording studios, his massive fortune entirely intact, his reputation permanently shielded by the brief existence of the marriage certificate. He walked away. Mandy Smith was 20 years old. She was abruptly thrust out of the elite bubble. She was dropped into a cold, unforgiving reality she had never been taught to navigate. The sudden, absolute rejection by the only authority figure she had known since youth triggered a catastrophic psychological collapse. Her mind struggled to cope. The human brain cannot process that level of systemic pressure, isolation, and sudden abandonment without severe consequences. She had been treated as an object modified for the presentation of a powerful man and cast aside when she was no longer visually stimulating. Her body immediately mirrored the collapse of her mind. She developed a severe, life-threatening eating disorder. In the context of extreme emotional distress, anorexia is rarely a simple desire to be thin. It is a desperate, subconscious attempt to regain lost autonomy. Mandy Smith had spent 5 years possessing absolutely no control over her own physical form. Bill Wyman had dictated her wardrobe. He had dictated her cosmetics. He had dictated her schedule. Her body had been public property, consumed by the press and controlled by her partner. When he discarded her, the sudden absence of control was terrifying. She sought a mechanism to govern her own physical existence. She found that control in the absolute restriction of food. She could not control the press. She could not control the legal system. She could not control the man who had shaped her youth, but she could control what entered her mouth. She could dictate the exact dimensions of her own form. She stopped eating. Her weight plummeted. She restricted herself with a terrifying singular focus. The illness consumed her. Her internal organs began to fail. Her immune system collapsed. She lost her hair. Her body began to consume its own muscle tissue to survive. She was systematically erasing her own physical presence. She was trying to shrink, trying to disappear from a world that had only ever viewed her as a commodity. The reaction of the British media to her physical collapse was an act of supreme hypocrisy. The very same tabloid newspapers that had celebrated her public appearances now mobilized to document her decline. The photographers who had once shouted her name outside London nightclubs now stalked her outside medical clinics. They deployed telephoto lenses to capture images of her emaciated frame. They published graphic, shocking photographs of her protruding collarbones and hollow cheeks. They did not apologize for their role in her trajectory. They did not publish editorials reflecting on the complicity of the press in normalizing the situation of a 13-year-old. They did not investigate the systemic failures that allowed a rock star to operate with such impunity. They simply shifted their narrative strategy. They transitioned seamlessly from selling the glamour of her youth to selling the horror of her collapse. Media attention continued even during her difficult period after the divorce. They printed the photographs of her skeletal body next to bold sensationalist headlines. They counted the profits. They acted as spectators to a life they had helped shape. The media machinery processed her a second time. She was declining in public, a discarded figure from a rock and roll narrative, entirely unprotected from the gaze of the nation. The archival photographs from the mid-1980s strip away the manufactured glamour entirely. The visual record shows a man pushing 50, his skin weathered by decades of intense substance use, late nights, and the grueling friction of international touring. Standing next to him, physically tethered to him, is a young teenager. The aggressive layer of liquid foundation, the dark eyeliner, and the blood-red lipstick were transparent forgeries. They could not hide the fundamental biology of a 13-year-old, the soft, unformed structure of her jawline, or the roundness of her cheeks. Furthermore, the eyes staring back from those photographs did not project adult confidence. They projected the hypervigilant strain of someone overwhelmed. It is the look of a middle school student drowning in an adult environment, desperately trying to maintain a pose she does not understand, to appease a man she cannot defy. The image induces profound discomfort. It is a biological warning signal. Every human instinct suggests that the dynamic captured in the photograph is fundamentally unbalanced. It is a highly concerning dynamic captured on film. The British press printed these images daily. They labeled them society news. They called her the luckiest teenager in the world. They wrote articles analyzing the cut of her designer dresses. They printed gossip columns detailing the menus of her lavish vacations. The media acted as the primary normalizing mechanism. They took the dark reality of a middle-aged man isolating a youth and washed it in the bright, blinding colors of celebrity culture. They normalized the situation. Many critics argue that media coverage at the time failed to fully address the seriousness of the situation. They provided the applause track for a powerful figure. They validated the mother's ambition. They silenced the individual's internal alarm system by constantly reinforcing the narrative that her situation was a fairy tale. The mythology that protects these men relies on the illusion of rebellion. Bands like the Rolling Stones sold millions of records, trading on the image of danger, anti-establishment defiance, and boundary-pushing behavior, convincing society that their artistic output required a certain level of moral flexibility. However, there is nothing rebellious about a millionaire targeting a 13-year-old from a working-class family. It requires zero courage to manipulate someone who lacks the cognitive development to push back. It requires zero defiance to influence a mother desperate for financial security. It is the ultimate abuse of structural power. The music does not matter. The sold-out stadiums do not mitigate the damage. The platinum records are entirely irrelevant to the arithmetic of the situation. A chord progression does not grant immunity from basic ethical standards. The story of Bill Wyman and Mandy Smith does not end with a soaring guitar solo. It does not end with a triumphant encore. It ends in a sterile courtroom in a hospital ward. The divorce papers were filed. The legal dissolution was finalized. Bill Wyman walked out of the court with his fortune, his freedom, and his legacy protected by a battalion of lawyers and public relations executives. He returned to his mansion. He returned to the adulation of his fans. The machine closed ranks around him, seamlessly absorbing the scandal and moving forward to the next lucrative tour date. Mandy Smith walked out with a shattered mind and a failing body. She was left to pick up the pieces of a life that had been fundamentally altered before it ever actually began. She survived the anorexia. She survived the physical collapse, but the toll was absolute and permanent. The brief 17-month marriage was merely the final act of a 5-year situation. He used the legal system to close the chapter on his past, and then he walked away. The narrative of Bill Wyman and Mandy Smith is an unforgiving indictment of a society that places fame and wealth above basic human safety. It completely shatters the glamorous illusion of the music industry and exposes the self-serving machinery operating backstage. A 47-year-old man utilized his immense wealth and cultural status to navigate society. He operated with total impunity because the system was designed to protect him. A mother traded her daughter's physical and psychological environment for financial proximity to the elite class. The press celebrated the narrative of a minor to increase their daily circulation numbers. The authorities looked at a highly visible situation and chose not to intervene. This is the true devastating cost of unchecked influence. It corrupts the individuals who wield it, and it absolutely damages the vulnerable people caught in its gravitational pull. Mandy Smith was never a willing participant in a controversial romance. She was a subject of systemic, multi-tiered pressure. Her youth was consumed as raw material. Her identity was heavily influenced and overwritten. Her internal suffering was silenced, while her external image was heavily monetized. The legacy of this era is not solely defined by stadium tours or platinum records. It is permanently tethered to a 13-year-old, isolated, shaped, and ultimately discarded by a system that placed fame far above basic human safety. The applause has long faded. The stadiums are empty. The story remains a devastating testament to how fame can act as a shield, how wealth distorts reality, and how the silence of the complicit is a failure that echoes forever.